Thank you for joining us. My name is Barry Erickson, and I'm Community Engagement Coordinator at Wheaton Public Library. Tonight, we are delighted to bring you this presentation on global population trends. Dr. Matthew Green is a professor and chair of sociology at the College of DuPage. He teaches Introduction to Sociology, Social Problems, and Statistics for the Social and Behavioral Sciences. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Green. Thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you everybody for being here. I was thinking about what Barry was saying as far as the upcoming schedule. It's going to be difficult for me to compete with Abraham Lincoln over Zoom. But let me get my presentation here. And as Barry was saying, what I'll be doing intermittently throughout the presentation is I'll stop at natural points, and if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise them, and I'll try to address them as best I can. So yes, I wanted to talk about global population trends this evening. This is something that I teach each semester in my Introduction to Sociology class. And it's a very timely presentation to give now, as we'll see why in a few moments. But if you do have any questions, once again, feel free to raise them, or if you have questions after the fact, feel free to reach out to me at my email address at the college. So with respect to global population, I think a good place to start is thinking about how many people there are in the world today. Obviously, we can't know exactly what the total is, but I think a good link I wanted to share with everybody to begin with is giving a good estimate of how many people there are in the world, and also thinking about more specifically how many people there are in the United States at the moment. And this website is for the US Census Bureau, the population clock. You can see what the Census Bureau has is an estimate of what the global population is and the population here in the United States. Let me just make this a little bit larger for everybody. There we go. And the estimated population in the United States right now, 334,363,175 or so. And according to the Census Bureau, the estimated world population, according to them, and this isn't a universally agreed upon number, but by their estimates, the world population is at 7,950,510,000 and rapidly rising. They also have this list of the 10 most populous countries in the world, according to their estimates. And you can see that China and India are #1 and #2 respectively, and it's not even close. It's actually pretty remarkable. I mean, you can see China and India, two single largest countries on the planet. But after that, the United States, we're #3, but we are, as you can see, a distant third. I mean, there's a good gap of 1 billion plus people between us and India. And then you could see most people probably wouldn't guess the 4th largest country in the world is Indonesia, but it is. Then you've got Pakistan, Nigeria, Brazil, Bangladesh, Russia, and Mexico. Then on the left, what I wanted to show you, which I really like to show my students as well, is the components of population change. This is simply for the United States. And what this shows is what I like to term the 3 ingredients of population change within a single country. In demography, the study of populations, when you're looking at any single country, it's going to be a mix of three factors that determines the population change within that society. It's going to be a combination of births, deaths, and migration. And here in the United States, it's estimated that one baby is born every 9 seconds. And one person dies every 10 seconds. And both of these, it's pretty remarkable if you think about it. I mean, just in the time I've been blabbing away, I mean, how many babies have been born already? But, we have roughly 6, 7 babies born per minute in the United States, and roughly 6 people pass away every minute. And you think about it, I mean, it's very simple math. If you have somebody being born more frequently than somebody passes away, that's going to lead to population increase over time. Then the other ingredients in population change, if you will, is migration into and out of a country. And the United States is one of those countries that draws more people in through immigration than we lose through emigration, which is not always the case around the world. It's actually more common to see in a lot of countries, it's more common for them to lose people than to gain people through immigration. But the United States, we're a pretty popular global migration destination. And according to the Census Bureau, we gain 1 international migrant every 29 seconds. So you add all this together, basically about 6 or 7 babies being born a minute, roughly 6 people passing away per minute. Then we get another 2 people moving into the United States per minute. And that translates into a net gain of 1 person every 22 seconds, which translates to the slowly but surely increasing population number here in the United States. Let me go back to the presentation then. Now, the Census Bureau's estimate of what the global population looks like actually differs from the more, I would arguably, the more authoritative United Nations estimates. Because when I was initially saying at the opening that this topic is very timely, is because as of the estimate is mid-November of last year, global population reached a milestone. We reached an estimated total of 8 billion people on the planet. And almost assuredly, it's more than that now. But to kind of answer the question of, okay, how many people are there in the world? I would defer to the United Nations estimate more than the Census Bureau estimate, saying that we have at least 8 billion people on the planet at this point. And what this graphic shows is how the trend line for global population growth over the last 70 plus years or so. And it's pretty remarkable how fast the world's population has grown. The thing is, if you look at this trend line, and if you were to go to the left and go, before 1950, go back to early 20th century, 19th century, for centuries, global population growth was actually pretty flat. We've really only seen the trend line increase dramatically within the last 50 to 100 years or so. I mean, it took a long time for the world to reach 1 billion, then 2 billion. But simply within the last 70 plus years, we've gone from like 2 billion or so up to where we are today, 8 billion. And what's been going on in terms of the recent milestones going from 6 to 7 to 8 billion, as I said, it took a long, long time for the world to get up to like 1 billion, then 2 billion. But just kind of illustrate how fast global population has been, growth has been accelerating. It took a dozen years between 1998 and 2010 for the world population to get from 6 billion to 7 billion. And it's similarly taken another dozen years to get from 7 billion to 8 billion last year. Based on the current trend line, if you were to extrapolate from, the trend line we see from recent history, the projections that I was reading was that we're expected to reach our next threshold of 9 billion in about 14, 15 years from now. It would be 14 years from now, 2037. So unless something dramatic happens, like maybe another global pandemic or something, even then, something like that is not enough to maybe put that much of a dent in these global population trends. But the estimate at this point is it'll take another little more than a dozen years to get to 9 billion. But one thing about global population growth, as you might expect, it's not uniform around the world. In other words, not all countries are growing at the same pace at the same time. And the projection for the next 30 years or so is that the bulk of the world's population growth is expected to take place in just little more than a handful of countries. And we're not talking typically about rich developed countries like the United States or places in Europe, Germany, Britain, or Japan, places like that. Most of the global population growth in the immediate future is expected to happen in Africa. 5 of these 8 countries are in Africa: Congo, Egypt, Ethiopia, Nigeria, and Tanzania. And another 3 are in Asia: India, Pakistan, and the Philippines. And as we saw from the global population clock, I think India, once again, it was number 2, and Pakistan is also on that top list as well. And a couple of things I wanted to show you here, just to kind of also talk about this, the global spread of population growth and population numbers. This is also a kind of a remarkable statistic, is when you're looking at the world today, around half of the world's population only lives in 7 countries. And so you can see this from the top list of the largest countries in the global population clock. But really, we're talking about 6 or 7 countries where about half the world's population lives. A good chunk of it, once again, is in China and in India. But these top 7 countries make up, 4.13 billion people on the planet as of last summer. And then the rest of the world is another roughly 4 billion or so. Now, the last thing I want to show you here before I kind of stop for a moment to address any questions folks might have is thinking about the future. I mean, I said that, one of the projections was that we'd get to 9 billion by 2037 or so. But going even further, what are some of the projections for what the world will look like in terms of total population? So this dates back from, I found this a couple of years ago. So this is kind of before we reached the 8 billion mark. But this is UN population scenarios, and obviously can't predict the future with certainty. But what these represent are educated guesses that the United Nations has put together for where the world is going in terms of population growth. What color is that? That's kind of a black, the darkest colored line for constant fertility. That's assuming that we just kind of continue growing at our present pace. So we're at about 8 billion now. It would be projected we'd reach about 12 or 13 billion maybe by mid-century. And that, look at this, by the start of the 22nd century, by the year 2100, if we kept growing at our current pace, we would have a global population north of 20 billion. So you think traffic is bad now? No, but seriously, this isn't going to happen. I mean, that would assume kind of this kind of current pace of growth, but the United Nations they throw the numbers out there, but that's not a likely scenario. The most liberal scenario that they plot out is the high variance. So it wouldn't be the kind of the current pace, but it would be the most kind of liberal estimate of where the population would go. And we'd be going from what, 8 billion or so today to almost doubling by the end of the century. So that would still be pretty remarkable, going from about 8 billion today to a little north of 15 billion by the end of the century. The middle of the road estimate says we go from about 8 billion today. We continue growing for another 40, 50 years or so, but probably by say 2075, 2080, global population would level off and that we'd end the century at about 11 billion. So going from about 8 billion now to 11 billion at the end of the century. So that would still be pretty significant as well. But the most conservative estimate, this low variant, is an interesting possible path, where what the low variant predicts is that we will continue to grow until around mid-century, go from maybe 8 billion to looks like around 9 billion or so by mid-century. But then over the remaining 40, 50 years of the 21st century, we would see progressive population decline. So that if the low variant was the eventual scenario that plays out, by the year 2100, we'd basically be where we are today, roughly around 8 billion or so. Obviously, nobody can know for sure, but these are the different scenarios that demographers, experts at the United Nations have kind of played out. Okay, let me stop for a moment. Are there any questions about these global population trends that anybody had right now?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Green. Someone is asking, do other countries conduct their census taking the same way we do? And perhaps maybe you can talk a little bit about why there's that difference between the census estimate and the United Nations estimate.
Well, I don't know why the Census Bureau estimate is so divergent from the United Nations estimate. I mean, it is kind of surprising because according to the Census Bureau, we still haven't reached 8 billion. But you know, when thinking about the U.S. population numbers, obviously, I think I would defer to the Census Bureau as far as that goes. But for the United Nations numbers, or the United Nations numbers looking for the global population, I would defer to them. But as far as methodology, I don't know the answer to as far as why the Census Bureau's global estimates are so divergent. And as far as other countries go, yeah, I mean, pretty much every developed country in the world, even the less developed countries, do conduct a census. But you know, and there are going to be different methodologies for doing it, you know, in terms of how frequently they do it and things like that. I mean, the only country I could think of, or countries I could think of that maybe don't do this sort of enumeration of their population, and I'm not even sure, but a place like maybe in North Korea, place that's going to be like really closed, and you know, there's so much about North Korean society we don't know anyways, and I'm pretty sure we don't have a good estimate of what their population is either.
Okay, thank you. Someone's asking about maybe variations that may happen based on world events. So for instance, how bad was the population drawdown or decrease during, say, the World War II years, or more recently with the pandemic? How much of a change do those kinds of massive world events really, what's the impact of those?
They do have an impact, for sure. I think probably, I think it's safe to assume that the pandemic certainly put a dent in some of these previous So if you had these global population trend line estimates, if this was a pre-pandemic one, I'm sure the United Nations made some fluctuations in terms of accounting for what happened in terms of the death toll from COVID-19. Because I mean, there's no way for us to know how many people really lost their lives during the pandemic. But the estimated range, globally is, I mean, we're talking about, I mean, millions, but I mean, tens to hundreds of millions. I mean, there's really no way to know for sure. And even the countries that have the best data, there's going to be deaths due to the pandemic that were unaccounted for. But certainly those are going to be the kinds of things that could alter some of these projections. I mean, it's going to be these sort of world historical events. It's going to be a pandemic, a once in a century pandemic. It's going to be a major, conflict in terms of war, like World War II. I mean, hopefully we don't have anything like that in our future, of course, but it's that kind of stuff. I mean, that's sort of like world historical events that can play a role in altering these sort of demographic projections.
Right. I think we're looking at that steady line on a couple slides back, and it looks so definitive. But as we're thinking about world events like World War II, it seems like there would be a little bit more variation there. And so, for instance, if it was like a bar graph or something like that, it might look a little bit different going year to year. Someone else is asking, back to those predictions, what were, yeah, sorry, we've got you going between slides here.
It's okay.
What sorts of major events or factors might affect those predictions?
Well, and that kind of foreshadows some of the things I'm going to be talking about, because I think the variables that are going to impact these projections are not going to be so much the sort of major world historical events. It really has to do with simply demographic factors more than anything in terms of population changes within countries. Because I mean, the thing I think that's going to impact whether we have the high variant or the low variant is going to be things like how many children are born, as opposed to things like, the things that are going to be taking a lot of lives, like wars and pandemics and things like that. So yeah, I would think of it in terms of, sure, so some of these events could play a role, but I think a lot of the variation in these different predictions boils down in large part to sort of demographic changes within society, and then kind of, writ large for the world as a whole.
Right. And someone else is asking, and this may be a good transition into future comments. They're asking what the impact is of projected global growth on food and water and land availability and those types of things. I don't know if those are possibly things that you'll be touching on further on in the presentation.
Yeah, I think that certainly, I mean, that's kind of beyond the scope of demography to a certain extent in terms of thinking about these environmental impacts. But definitely, that can play a role. I mean, in terms of, food availability, environmental impacts, things like that. So those would be other, I think, variables to consider as well. Is that kind of addressing what the
Think so, and I always invite people, if you feel like your question wasn't quite answered, please feel free to type it into the Q&A again, and we'll revisit that issue.
Please.
Just one more thing before we let you keep going here. Someone asks, based on the data that you have available, do birth rates tend to decline in countries that attain increasing prosperity?
I'm going to talk about that.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll let you go ahead and do that then. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Barry. And good questions, everybody. Thinking about what's happening in the world as a whole, the next step, I think, is to think about what happens within particular countries. Because like I said, when you're thinking about, say, what's going to happen in the future, global population growth isn't going to be uniform. It's going to be faster and more rapid in some places and slower, and actually maybe leading to decline in populations in other places. A couple demographic concepts to introduce you here that are going to have an impact, that do have an impact on population growth and change. One is probably a term you've heard before, life expectancy. It's a very straightforward indicator. What this represents is when you have life expectancy for a particular year, say you have a child born in 2023, it represents the number of years the average person born during that calendar year can expect to live. Obviously, it's not going to be a prediction, but the idea is that all things considered, a child born in such and such a year can expect to live so many years. But when you think about the trend line over the last 50, 75 years in terms of why global population growth has been so rapid, in large part, it has to do with the increase in life expectancy in the United States and pretty much everywhere else in the world. Just to kind of illustrate, thinking about America in particular, it's pretty remarkable. You go to the turn of the 20th century, in year 1900, the year 1900, a child born in the year 1900 had a life expectancy of about 40. Which is pretty, I mean, it's amazing when you think about it by today's standards, that an infant born in 1900 would have a life expectancy of 40. Now, statistically, that's what the figure is, but kind of an interesting footnote with respect to that is that, okay, the statistical life expectancy at that point in our history was 40, but if that infant survived his or her first year, then she or he can expect to live to a more reasonable number. I mean, the life expectancy would be like 58. So what this illustrates is you go back to America 100, 125 years ago, we had really high rates of what's called infant mortality. I mean, you had much higher numbers of infants dying, shortly after they were born. But the thing is, if that infant lived to see his or her first birthday, then that child can expect to live a decent lifespan. But still, by today's standards, 58 is not that long, because the most recent data I was able to find, according to the government Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, a baby born in 2021, that's the most recent calendar year they have numbers for, life expectancy 76.1. So that average baby born 2 years ago can expect to live about 76 years. Now that looks good, certainly relative to where we were turn of the 20th century. But perhaps some of you have seen this in the news in recent years. We've seen actually a drop in life expectancy in the United States over the last couple of years. You go back to 2019, the life expectancy in America was closer to 79. So we've seen a roughly 3-year drop in life expectancy since 2019, which is the largest such 2-year drop in our history in the last century. I mean, the last time we saw such a rapid drop was in the 1920s. Now, why is that? Certainly, this is something where the pandemic has played a role. But there's also other things going on. One class I teach is social problems at the college. And a big thing that's been happening is you've got a lot of preventable deaths from the opioid epidemic. There's some scholars, they've written a book called Deaths of Despair, talking about so many middle-aged Americans who are dying prematurely due to alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide. They're dealing with depression, things like that. So we've unfortunately taken a dip in life expectancy in the United States. I mean, the trend line has been one of continual increase, but we've seen a bit of a downturn, unfortunately, in recent years. But life expectancy globally, invariably, you go around the world, when you look at life expectancy numbers, the baby girl always has a higher life expectancy number than the baby boy. Typically, it's going to be something like maybe a 2-3 year gap or so. And the thing is, people wonder, okay, well, why are females expected to live longer than males? And it's interesting. It's kind of a nature versus nurture kind of debate. I mean, you can make an argument, well, why do men have shorter lifespans? Some of it is behavioral, but what my understanding of what the scientific consensus is that essentially women are biologically simply built to last longer, to put it in a blunt way, than men are. And the way they kind of determine this is, they take women who maybe engage in kind of more dangerous behaviors like men do. They have dangerous jobs, they smoke, they drink, they get into fights. And these women will still live longer than men who engage in comparable behaviors. But with life expectancy, what you also see is pretty significant variation around the world. I mean, it's a good indicator of how developed a society is. Because as you might expect, the countries that have the highest life expectancy are going to be the richest, most advanced countries. The countries around the world that have the lowest life expectancies are going to be the poorest ones in the planet. Now, the other demographic concept we want to think about here in terms of impacting population growth is fertility. It's not the only one. I mean, you can think about mortality as well. But fertility is thinking about the rate of children being born within a particular society. And the one statistic I like to use when talking about this is a statistic that demographers use called the total fertility rates, the TFR. And it's actually a very simple measure. What it represents is the average number of births per woman during her peak childbearing years, which in demographic terms are considered ages 15 to 44. In other words, what the TFR, it's a number. What it represents is the number of children the average woman is expected to have during the course of her lifetime. So in common sense terms, it's a very easy number to comprehend. With fertility, the number to bear in mind when you look at data on the TFR on a country by country basis, the magic number is a TFR of 2.1. The idea being that if a society has a TFR higher than 2.1, or at least 2.1 or higher, all things being equal, as long as you don't have any like really significant spikes in mortality or outmigration, if your TFR is 2.1 or higher, you can expect to see population growth over time. But if that TFR is lower than 2.1, if the average woman in a country has fewer than 2 children over the course of her lifetime, unless you have like massive immigration, you're generally going to see population decline. And the figure on the right shows the total fertility rate worldwide over a good 65 plus year period. You go back mid-20th century, globally, the TFR was about 4.5 from the 1950s to around 1970. So what that means is the average woman around the world would have 4, perhaps 5 babies over the course of her lifetime. But since 1970, that number has progressively dropped. As of 2017, the most recent data point, global TFR is about 2.3, 2.4 or so. So another way of thinking about this is that the average woman in the world today, or at least as of 2017, has half as many children as she would have had mid-20th century. What I wanted to show you, and I'm gonna have to stop my screen share to pull up this website. Here we go. Okay, so this is a website. It's actually the CIA's website. I didn't know this until I just kind of stumbled upon this website some years ago. But the CIA actually compiles data on various demographic indicators, like the total fertility rates. So you could find for 227 countries around the world, the total fertility rates in these different places. And the countries today, or at least as of 2022, that have the highest TFRs, if my geography is correct, they're all in Africa. In Niger, the average woman in Niger has 6.82 children over the course of her lifetime. So for all intents and purposes, she has about 6 or 7 babies over the course of her lifetime. But for these really high-ranked countries, you've got TFRs in the 5, 6 territory. And we kind of scroll our way down this list here. Excuse me. What you tend to see here is all of these really high TFR countries tend to be poor developing countries. Generally what you see, the more developed a country is, the richer it is, the lower its fertility rates. And I'm just going to kind of scroll down to the very bottom here so we can see the lowest TFR countries. And here we go. According to the CIA, Taiwan, which the Chinese Communist Party would not consider a separate country, but that's another topic in and of itself. But Taiwan, the TFR there is 1.08, South Korea 1.1, Singapore 1.16. So you could see in these East Asian countries and Italy and Puerto Rico, Spain, you've got TFRs well below 2.1. And as I said before, unless a country has like massive levels of immigration, you know, it's not going to, sorry, where's my presentation? There it is. Unless a country has massive levels of immigration, I mean, you're going to see population decline over time. Let me show you this data on the US total fertility rates, just so we could see what's happened in America over the last 80 years or so. And what you see in America kind of dovetails with what's been going on globally. Interestingly, the total fertility rate, well, maybe not too surprisingly, considering a lot of men were overseas fighting World War II during the 1940s. But as you might expect, post-World War II, the baby boom, total fertility rates increased pretty dramatically, reached a peak in excuse me, late 1950s or so, right around 1960 of about 3.75. And from early 1960s, started to drop really dramatically, going to the mid-1970s. Interestingly, kind of rebounded during the 80s to around 1990, held fairly constant right around that 2.1 level for a good 20 years. But over the last 10 plus years, the total fertility rate has evidently dropped a bit further. Let me stop for a moment. Any questions about life expectancy or the total fertility rate before I continue?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Green. Someone's asking if you know, in recent years, which countries would be like in the top 5 or so of life expectancy?
Oh, probably look on that CIA website. But I mean, I think it's going to be, you think about the wealthiest countries and the most advanced countries. I think someplace like Japan is going to be on there, South Korea. Um, I would guess maybe some of the Nordic countries, Sweden, Finland, places like that. But if my memory is correct, I mean, two of the top ones are going to be Japan and South Korea. I think Japan is #1, and South Korea is projected to surpass Japan in life expectancy, because I remember seeing something about South Korea is going to be the first country, if it hasn't reached that point already, to be the first country to have a life expectancy um, in the 90s, where basically a baby girl born in South Korea in the not too distant future, she will be the first person on the planet to have a life expectancy of 90 years.
Wow. All right. Someone made a comment about risk avoidance, and I think that has to do with why perhaps women live longer lives than men. And the next couple of questions relate to China. So I don't know whether that's something that perhaps you're going to be getting into. They're asking about that one child per household law and what China's TFR is. So if you want to just continue the presentation, because you're going to be addressing that.
Yeah, let me do so, because I do want to talk about China in particular here. So the kind of question to think about is like, what's going on? I mean, why is the TFR so low in particular countries? It's not that bad in the US, but as we saw from that data, it's definitely lower in some other places. And there's no one single explanation. I mean, some of the arguments that have been made for why the TFR is so low in some countries is that today infant mortality levels are much lower, so women end up having fewer babies. The idea being, if the infant mortality level was high, maybe a woman would have 4 or 5 babies, but she couldn't expect all of them to live to adulthood, and things like that. Now, due to advances in medical care and technology, that's not going to be so much of a concern in the rich world. Definitely have been a game changer over the last 50 years has been contraception. I mean, the widespread availability of effective birth control and knowledge of and access to it has simply given couples and women in particular more control over their reproductive abilities. Because the argument that can be made is that one of the reasons why the TFR is so high in some of these poor countries is because women don't have that same ability to control their reproductive, their reproductive abilities, basically. And what's going on is that in the rich world, a big reason why the TFR is lower and has lowered is because women and couples who are sexually active are able to use contraception effectively to dictate how many children they do have, if they're going to have any. Then you think about changes in women's role in society, being able to work and go to school more than they were in generations past. Certainly the cost of having and raising kids has been a major factor for a lot of folks. And I was just reading this article in the New York Times about South Korea. Women in South Korea are on strike against being, quote, baby-making machines. So we saw from that CIA data, South Korea has like one of the lowest TFRs in the world, according to their data. I guess in South Korea, I mean, their TFR is actually south of 1 at this point. But a big reason why, according to this article, is that, South Korea has very traditional gender norms, and many women are simply opting out of marriage and having children because the expectations placed upon them are unreasonable in so many ways. And you can understand why when you think about some of these pressures that are put on them. Let me see. The problem with TFRs being too low is, as you might expect, if a country has a really low TFR for an extended period of time, it's going to lead to population decline. So today, about 2/3 of the world's people live in countries with TFRs less than 2.1. And if things kind of continue at their present pace, the projections is that about 23 countries in the world are expected to see their populations drop by half. And almost invariably, these are going to be low TFR countries, places like Japan, Italy, Spain, South Korea. And you see this BBC graphic on the right showing the population of certain countries as of 2017 and what their projected population is at the end of the century. And look at the numbers for like China and Japan, for instance. I mean, China at about 1.4 billion today. Their projected population by the end of the century is expected to be about half what it is today, which is mind-boggling if that ends up working out. Similar with Japan. I mean, Japan's not as large, but it's expected to see a commensurate sort of drop. India seen a bit of a drop. US expected to increase. Nigeria expected to increase dramatically. But this is one of the consequences of low TFR. Unless you have a lot of immigration coming in, it just makes sense. Unless enough babies are being born, there's going to be population decline. Speaking of China, let me wrap up my presentation talking about China, because China is an interesting case in and of itself. This is data on the TFR for both the US and the People's Republic of China going back to 1960. You go back to 1960s, right around 1970, China's TFR was pretty high. I mean, the average Chinese woman was having 5 or 6 babies over the course of her lifetime. Started to really drop during the 1970s, held pretty constant in the 80s, and then by like the early 90s, their TFR actually fell below the United States TFR level, to the point where today it's considered to be roughly equivalent. And the reason why, and somebody I think was alluding to this in one of their comments or questions, was thinking about what China has done that no other country has done, and has basically tried to artificially manage fertility and artificially micromanage population in their country. So I assume many of you have heard of the one-child policy that was in place. It's not there anymore. But for a good, almost 40, no, about 35 years or so, I'd say, China had a one-child policy, which, as the name implies, the Chinese government limited, not all, but most couples to only having one baby. They kind of loosened up the policy as time went on a bit. But as of a few years ago, the one-child policy is no more. But the thing is, Chinese government didn't do away with the one-child policy. They just substituted for a two-child policy instead. And now it's actually a three-child policy. And the thing about the way they implemented the policy, I mean, it was just really, if any of you have heard some of the horror stories about the one-child policy, it's really sad stuff. I mean, just how it was like brutally enforced, things like, the population control authorities and, giving women forced abortions, forced sterilizations. There was a lot of sex-selective abortions that were happening, where couples would get an ultrasound, see what sex the baby would be. If it wasn't the desired sex, they just abort the fetus. And specifically, if it was a female fetus. So, a lot of girls that normally would have been born during this 35-plus-year period did not get born. And if they were born, they were unwanted, infanticide would happen. I mean, they would be killed off, or they would just be abandoned. So China's TFR today, the most recent data I saw was 1.3. So quite a bit lower than the US, and certainly well below the needed TFR of 2.1 to experience, any sort of significant population growth. But certainly a big effect too has been this kind of gender disparity, where in China, there has been just like, over the last few decades, there's just developed like a huge surplus of boys relative to men. And that's led to all kinds of sociological problems as well. And I'm kind of running out of time here, but the last thing I'll mention is that we're starting to see like the real world impact of this. We've been seeing it anyways for decades now, but China's population is starting to shrink. And the projection is that sometime this year, India is actually going to surpass China as the most populous country in the world. And for the first time in, I guess, recorded history, China will not be the largest country on the planet. India is going to be the new #1. Okay, let me stop here. Any additional questions that folks have in the time we do have remaining?
Thank you, Dr. Green. There were just a couple of comments about the TFR in China, and someone's just confirming that perhaps birth control was responsible for a lot of the population drop. Someone else is asking the impact of once one has passed a certain age on life expectancy. So someone's asking if your life expectancy changes as you age, what is the life expectancy of someone who has made it to age 60? Is that significantly more perhaps than looking at it from birth?
You can actually look this up. I've looked it up before too, is that you can actually find your current life expectancy. And as logic would dictate, the longer you've been alive at this point, the longer you can kind of continue to be expected to live. So you can actually, you'd have to like Google it, but find it's like a life expectancy calculator. It'll ask you like what year you were born, how old you are now, maybe ask you some basic like health related questions. And it'll tell you how long you're expected to live at this point. It's kind of scary because you might not want to, the older we get, you probably don't want to see that kind of impending mortality right in front of you. But certainly, life expectancy tends to be longer, the longer, if that makes sense, if you've lived up to a certain point, your continued life expectancy is maybe a bit higher than it would otherwise be.
Right, thank you. And so I'll just invite people again, if you have any questions, to go ahead and put those into the Q&A. I'm just wondering if you can make any comments about that huge population growth in Africa, and perhaps what some of the implications of that might be.
Oh, another thing I just read is that Africa's population, if I remember correctly, the population in Africa now is larger than the combined population in North America and Europe together, which is pretty remarkable. But a big thing that's going on there is you think about those ingredients of population change, fertility, mortality, and migration. What's going on in Africa is that it's still going to be in large part, poor developing part of the world, but they're getting relatively richer. And as they do, they're going to see mortality drop. And if fertility continues to stay high, that's going to be the impetus for this kind of continued population growth. But some of the impacts, we're seeing it now. And when you think about global migration, maybe not so much here in the United States, but if you're familiar with a lot of the concerns about immigration to continental Europe, some of it is, there are going to be refugees from places like Syria and places like that. But a lot of them are poor African migrants who are crossing, say, the Mediterranean to get into Greece and Italy and things like that. So they're very much on the front lines of what's been going on with kind of these demographic trends in Africa. And it's led to just a lot of problems just within the last decade or so in continental Europe in terms of dealing with this influx of migration, and particularly from Africa.
Right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. It looks like there aren't any other questions. We'll give people one more minute to think if they have anything and go ahead and type that into the chat. In the meantime, I'll just say again that I'm going to be sending out an email to everyone who's registered for the program with just a couple links. 2 additional resources for you. If you are watching the recording of this presentation and would like those, just email me at ce@wheatonlibrary.org. That's CE for community engagement at wheatonlibrary.org, and I'd be happy to send those out to you. So it looks like there are just some thank yous in the chat for this great information. Thank you so much, Dr. Green. I think that's it for tonight. So thank you to everyone for joining us. We hope you stay safe and healthy, and we hope that you'll join us again soon. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Green.